Hi, this is JR Fibonacci, and this is a piece on the contrast between those who are adaptive and focus on adapting, and those who are reactive, who focus on the government. I could also say totalitarians, anyone who focuses on the government. Totalitarian's a label that may not be the most fitting, but I want to be a little dramatic. So I'm going to contrast Republicans and Democrats, popular political parties in the U.S., to give a sense of what I mean by totalitarians, because I'm considering both Democrats and Republicans as being really focused on governments, and that focus on government rather than adapting, like personal adaptiveness, personal adjusting. That focus on government is totalitarianism, as I'm using the term. I'll give an example of a forest fire from the year 2002 and how different people responded to it, what they had to say about it, some reacting, some adapting. So, basically, totalitarian. What I mean by that term is one who thinks of some government as responsible for the future of a particular region. Primarily responsible is some bureaucrats, some operation of government, whether that's the UN or the city or the county or the state or the NATO or even organizations like insurance companies and banks. If it's somebody else, then that's a reactive kind of mode. But in particular, any of the modes in which government, some form of government, is presumed to be responsible for how life goes, or how human life goes, like my life or someone else's life. If I am projecting responsibility or identifying responsibility as resting with governments, that could be the totalitarian mode of thinking. I'm also, incidentally, not meaning to condemn this mode. I'm just distinguishing it. I have been in that mode myself. So you might think of these as stages. Another tendency of people in the totalitarian mode is to think in terms of good and evil and right and wrong and condemnation and condoning or worship. So, totalitarian is one who thinks of a government as responsible for the future of a region, as well as the past and, for the reality of a region. Now, Democrats, represented by these glasses I've just put on, Democrats might say something like, if there's ever a problem with life, and we can always find one, of course, the government is the solution. The government will provide the solution. The government will be the primary mechanism for solving problems. In fact, governments identify problems too. That's who can count on them and rely on them to identify problems for us. We don't need the media to do it. We'll have the government tell the media, then the media will tell us. And then the government will solve our problems for us. We will solve our problems if we participate in solving them through our participation in politics and government. Now, Republicans, a different pair of glasses here. If there's ever a problem, the government's the source of the problem. We just need to stop doing what everything the government is doing that is the cause of the problem, and then things will be better. That's still a focus on governments. It's still a reactive mode where some experience of problem arises, and I already know my model for how to solve it. In the case of the Democrat, the government will solve the problem. It's just a matter of how. In the case of the Republican, the government's obviously the source of the problem. We just need to have that intervention by government that's currently causing the problem, have it discontinued, and then everything will be fine. Now, obviously, these are oversimplifications, but you might be able to identify these models as operating in a few cases. And I will give an alternative, by the way, as I said, this responsive or adaptive mode. I will give an alternative later, but I will first make a reference to, well, I'll go ahead and throw out a little preview of the alternative. Life is just however it is, and I'm responsible for my experience of life. I'm responsible for my future, for my past, for my life. That's the adaptive responsive mode, or responsible mode. If there are changes to be made, I will make them. The changes that are made that are relevant to me are the changes that I can make, not the changes that a government might make or a government might not make, and that we have to wait and go through elections and campaigns and wars and all these big systematic adventures and complications that involve huge systems and lots of red tape and bureaucracies and lots of people. No, instant adaptation is the focus of someone who's taking personal responsibility. So what change can I make right now? Or what change can I initiate right now? Maybe it takes a sequence of changes, a sequence of steps, but what can I do without having to focus so much on governments? All right, so now this wildfire in 2002 in northeast Arizona ultimately consumed about 500,000 acres of forest. I was amongst the first evacuees. Evacuating was definitely, is that reacting or adapting? Well, whatever. I'd say it was adaptive, even if it was reactive. Like, one of the interesting things is all of this mode of reaction, I'm contrasting it with adaptiveness, but consider that all of these reactions are actually stages of adaptation. They're just distinct from immediate personal adaptation. Like, there's a forest fire coming, I pack up my stuff and take my animals with me and go away from the fire. That's personal adaptation. Move away from the fire, move away from the danger, move away from the risk, move to safety. I'm setting up an analogy here. I noticed it as I'm saying it, but I didn't know I was going to do it until I was already doing it. So some of the things Democrats might have said when this 500,000 acre fire came out was, well, it's like the government should fix this fire, of course, and the government should do things to improve forest safety. The tribal governments of the Apache tribe, the federal government, the U.S. forestry folks, the state government of the state lands and state forests. These governments, they should thin out the forests. They should clear some corridors of trees and undergrowth, so that if a fire does come along, there's a corridor that doesn't have any fuel in it, so that the firefighters have a place to take a stand and perhaps break the fire at the point of those corridors or those gaps. So it's not an unintelligent response, right? It makes sense. The Republicans might have said something like the following: well, the problem with this whole forest fire situation is you have all this accumulated density of trees, all this accumulated undergrowth. Where did it come from? Well, it came from the government going in and putting out every little fire. You have all these lightning-initiated fires, decade after decade. The government goes in and puts them out because tourists don't like the smoke or whatever else. Timber companies don't like the fire either. So the government goes in and puts out the fire. Decade after decade, you have a buildup. Lots of dense trees, lots of dry undergrowth. All these trees in a region like Arizona, it's dry, so you have all these trees over soil that is getting just as much rain, more or less, as it did in previous decades. So each tree is really struggling for water, and the roots are dry, and so the rest of the tree is dry, so they're vulnerable to insects, and they're not getting as much sunlight per tree as they would have in the past because other trees are shading them from the sun. So you just have this huge density of trees, and it's the government that did this. Now, notice that casting blame at the government. I was supposed to put on my glasses when I did this. Governments are responsible for the forest fire because they kept putting out the fires and leading to this accumulation of dense undergrowth and all these trees. And the Democrats. Well, governments should go in and thin these forests. It's those darn environmentalists who have inhibited the government from proceeding. Environmentalists to blame. The government's the solution. Okay, so note, by the way, that those two interpretations of who's to blame aren't specifically related to whether someone's a Democrat or Republican. It's just a model. But it is about who's to blame. It doesn't actually, when the Republicans say the government shouldn't have been putting out forest fires, and that's led to the accumulation of the undergrowth and the density of trees. Well, that's true, but it doesn't. It doesn't actually resolve anything to point that out and to cast blame, to make an accusation. Isn't really adaptive. It's not a personal adaptation. You still have to flee the fire if the fire comes. That's the bottom line, really. Move away from danger, move towards safety. So what I've noticed is that the accusative mode or the reactive mode, you see that the Republicans tend to accuse government, and the Democrats tend to accuse the Republicans. It's the Republican environmentalists, or it's the Republican commercial interests that have kept us from the government from fixing this fire problem, this forest safety problem. So I don't even know if that applies very well, but you have this like contest or this antagonism between the two groups. Could be Republicans and Democrats in other nations and other places. It's other groups, but you have this divisive, totalitarian accusation exchange going on. And it's totalitarian because it's focused on governments. It's always governments should not have done this, or government should have done that. And in the future, the government should not do this. They should stop. And the government should do that. They should do more of it. What we need here, we have a failure in national security in 2001. What we need is more money poured into national security systems that look like they're a failure. That's the Republicans might say that. The Democrats, public education is a huge failure, so what? Or it's not doing as well as it should. So what we should do is pour more money into it. Or the health of the country is really pathetic. It's horrible. It's a problem. What we need is to pour more money in it from the federal government's treasuries. the energy crisis is a problem. What we need is the government to get out of the way, or the government to do more initiatives for alternative fuels, or the government 2, the government 3, the government 4. What? The government is the focus of all these reactive comments. Now, in contrast, we have adapting. Now, adapting in the case of the energy crisis could be getting more efficient light bulbs. It could be getting a more efficient vehicle, a motorcycle, a hybrid, etc. But in contrast to all that mode of accusation, we have a mode of innocence, where we might say, well, God is the source of all developments. I'm responsible for my experience of God's creation. God creates Republicans, Democrats, accusation, totalitarianism, divisiveness, wars, forest fires, trees, all that stuff. And I'm responsible for my experience of God's creation. I'm responsible for adapting. So if there is a forest fire and I notice danger or risk, then I move to safety. Now, the analogy I was setting up here is for for the issues that are more relevant to a large group of people, not so much forest fire, forest safety issues, but economic issues. Currently, we have rising gas prices. Well, a Republican might say it's the government that needs to, stop blocking the offshore oil drilling in Florida. Then oil prices will go down because and gasoline prices will go down because we'll have more of that fuel available to us quickly. But that's a focus on what government does or does not do. A Democrat might say, well, what we need to do, and because of this oil crisis, we need to go to war with a country that has a lot of oil and take their oil from them. Maybe that's not a Democrat. Maybe that's another Republican solution. But whatever, it's a government-focused solution. And another person might say, well, it's not that the government's to blame or that the government's going to rescue us, or the banks or the insurance companies or the foreign nation or the poor people or the rich people. We will adapt. If the prices of oil are going up, then we might just use less. Maybe that's the solution to an underlying problem. Maybe we should consider conservation. Not just efficiency, but using less. That's a radical and politically incorrect thing to say. Use less energy? Whoa. So, how about with regard to real estate prices? Well, if real estate prices are rising, most people say that's a good thing. People who want to buy and can't afford it and who are struggling might say, well, I wish it was cheaper. But the mainstream consensus is that rising real estate prices is good, predominantly among people who own real estate, you might notice. So Democrats, if real estate prices are rising, they'll say, well, what the government needs to do is do more interventions to keep prices rising. The government needs to manipulate the markets more, better. Democrats Governments need to manipulate markets more to preserve my real estate investments. Republicans. Governments need to get out of the way of the natural rise in real estate to preserve my real estate investments. The government's the problem. Now I have to think of an example of what the code regulations. The government, they put in these new code regulations. They have too much regulation of the Securities Exchange Committees and commissions and the courts, and someone's to blame. Someone else. It's the government, one of those governments. Someone else is to blame for my real estate prices going down, and I'm going to keep holding my real estate assets, but I'm going to blame someone else, whether it's the government or it's the Republicans. The Republicans are to blame for my real estate prices going down. Wait, no. It's the Democrats. The Democrats are to blame for my real estate investments losing value. Or one can adapt. One could do a personal adjustment in terms of what? Selling real estate. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. All of God's creation is fine. There's no problem. The opportunity is for me to adapt. I'm responsible for my experience of God's creation. The results that I experience, I'm responsible for. Real estate prices are coming down, sell. Or if they come down far enough and you couldn't afford real estate before, and then you can, maybe you buy at that point. But complaining and accusing and blaming, that's optional. All right, stock prices. Stock prices are coming down, and it's the Republicans' fault, and it's because of the central banks. It's because of we just need more government regulation. It's because of corrupt businessmen. It's the Republicans. So in the UK, prices of stocks and real estate are coming down. In the EU, in the US, it's all the same problem. It's the darn Republicans. It's the conservatives. It's the rich. We need the government to come and save us from the rich people. And then you have the other folks say, well, in the UK, US, and EU, stock prices are coming down as well as real estate prices. And you know what? It's the problem. It's the fault of the Democrats. And what we need is less government. The government has caused all these problems. We need to abolish the Federal Reserve. We need to restrict the spending of governments. They spend too much on social welfare. They spend too much on the military. They spend too much on education. They spend too much on roads. They spend too much on subsidies to farmers. They spend too much on giving money to poor people, diabetes research and cancer research, and they spend too much on national security. And what we really need is the government to stop messing with our stock market and our economy. And it's the Democrats for the problem. Okay, so there's your contrasting comment. When the wildfire comes, you get away from the danger, get away from the risk, and move to safety. An adaptive, innocent person might say, okay, stock prices are coming down. Maybe it's time to sell. The trees are coming down. They're burning. Maybe it's time to flee. Maybe it's time that I get out away from that tree falling down. I should get out of the way of it, huh? But it's the government who's to blame for the tree falling down. It's the Republicans who are to blame for the tree falling down. No, you get out of the way of the tree. You can blame people later, I suppose, if you really want to. Fine, go ahead, but get out of the way. If you are concerned about your investments and their change in value, you've invested in them. You do the research. You make the adjustments, or you do what it takes to make intelligent adjustments. Find people who've done the research. In my case, I've done a lot of research, as most of you may know. For several years, I've forecast all of the things I've talked about, except for the forest fire. Not that it wasn't forecast by other people, it was. But oil prices rising, leading to a decrease in stock prices and real estate prices. That was based, and also an increase in gas prices. All this stuff. Many people forecast that. It was easy to forecast. What you had to do to forecast it was think ahead and do a little research and have a little honesty, and maybe not be too attached to being reactive and blaming, who's to blame for this. Is it the Federal Reserve? Is it the Democratic Congress? Is it the insurance companies? Is it the farmers? Is it the Mexicans? Is it the Greeks? Is it the Irish? Is it the British? Is it the Russians? Well, you can blame till you're pink in the face. You're still going to adapt. Forest fire comes, flee. Real estate market crashes, sell. Or else, the government's going to come in and take it from you anyway, like they did in the Soviet Union. Same thing, more or less, for stock markets. Stock markets are crashing. Well, we just need the governments to come in and bail out the banks and bail out the auto industry and bail out the health industry and take over and health insurance. And well, look, it doesn't really get more secure when the government's promising the same thing that the insurance companies promised. How do I put it? When the government takes the risk of an economic, activity like the insurance industry or the auto industry, there's risk in doing business. So when that risk is in private hands of a few groups of investors, and then that risk is moved to the government, that doesn't eliminate the risk. It transfers it. Getting an insurance policy on your car doesn't reduce the risk of a hailstorm damaging your car or reduce the risk of an auto collision. It just transfers the risk from one party to another. This is kind of the basic thing that people don't seem to get, that are in that reactive, totalitarian, divisive accusation mode of blaming. It doesn't matter if it's the insurance companies or the politicians or the children who are to blame, or the grandparents. It doesn't really matter. If the insurance company is unstable and unsafe, having the government bear that risk or having the private shareholders bear that risk doesn't change the amount of risk. If the banks are doing risky real estate lending, the government bearing that risk doesn't change the amount of risk. It doesn't make the real estate market safer. It doesn't make the insurance industries, gambling any safer. If you have a government-run gambling operation like a lottery, the government bears the risk. If you have it run by an Indian tribe or something, like in Atlantic City or Las Vegas, some private business, it's the same odds. It's the same business. It's the same, realm of risk, the same range. In the cases of casinos and lotteries, of course, the risk is overwhelmingly with the people who invest, the people who gamble, the people who operate the scheme, the lottery or the casino or the insurance market, insurance industry. The people who operate these schemes, they're not generally the ones who really have the risk. It's the people who invest in them who are taking an enormous risk. The people who invest in real estate speculation, who invest in, I'm going to pay $100 a month and expect an insurance company to give me, $500,000 if I die, because I've given them $100 this month, so they're going to give me $500,000. That's like a lottery ticket. If you have a lot of people try and cash in their tickets all at once, in other words, in the case of life insurance, if a lot of people die all at once, what happens to that insurance company? It goes out of business. It can't pay all those claims. It doesn't have enough money. The insurance business is based on the idea that you're going to have a relatively low amount of claims come through any particular month or week or year. If there's a big surge of claims, that company's gone. Unless the government bails it out. But that doesn't decrease the risk. It just transfers the risk. Then the government's going to pay for it, and ultimately it's going to bring down governments. It's like oil. You can't, or a forest fire. You can't sign a bill that reduces the amount of fuel in a forest. You have to actually take action. You can't sign a bill that increases the amount of oil on the planet. That doesn't work. Personal adaptation sometimes is relevant. Sometimes it's good to sell out of risky or dangerous situations or to flee from risk. Sometimes it's intelligent and relevant to move to a safer position or to invest in other positions that are ripe to prosper. I'm going to close with that. To all of my Republican friends, you're to blame, says the Democrat. To all of my Democratic friends, you're to blame, says the Republican. And thanks for being to blame and blaming and listening and considering the possibility of adapting and having some freedom around blaming and antagonism and totalitarianism.